Hi, everyone. We are going to be going over tonight Chapter 5, which is Business Communications. Incidentally, if you have not taken a business communication, you probably haven't. If you're in the Business 100 class, this is your first foray into business communications. I highly recommend taking a separate business comm class. I teach one at Miramar College, Business 119, Business Communication. It's an excellent course to really get you good at communicating in a business setting. There are always so many changes going on with business communications. We are constantly evolving because of technology, and you can really succeed if you can master communication skills. When you look at the top 10 attributes that employers are seeking when they're hiring a student, communication is always in the top 10, both verbal communication and written communication. They want you to be able to read well and to speak well, to be able to give a presentation, to know how to communicate. And so I highly recommend taking that course. We're going to give you an introduction to business communications here today. Let me start by sharing with you Chapter 5 in the lecture notes. Again, remember, there will be blank spots, and it is your job to go ahead and fill them out. So what are we saying when we're saying business communication? We're talking about transmitting information between the sender and the receiver. It includes listening, active listening, seeking and understanding feedback, responding appropriately. And there are always going to be obstacles to communication. We call these barriers, including noise. And noise is any interference that causes the message from one sender to be different from what the audience hears. Many of us have played that game when we were younger of telephone. That's an excellent example of a barrier to communication and noise. So, I wanted to say first before we move on, communication needs to be dynamic. It has to be fluid. It has to be two-way. Listening is such a big part of communication. Speaking and understanding the feedback from the audience, responding appropriately. These are really at the core of business communications. And I wanted to talk about some of the barriers to communication and some of the noise that many of us encounter. So there are several different types of barriers to communication. Examples of physical barriers would be things like a room being freezing cold, chairs that are made in a way that the listeners sit lower than the speaker, chairs that are particularly uncomfortable. One of the types of physical barriers to communication that you might see, especially when somebody's trying to affect that barrier or try to increase that, sometimes you'll see somebody who's sitting with a window behind him or her that's really bright so that you can't see that person, which is it's a terrible way for effective communication. It's important that the speaker should not only should not only speak to the listener, but also try to speak in a way that the listener can understand the language. And if they're not an English language speaker, don't use slang, don't use jargon, don't use language that is above that person's or the listener's understanding level. In terms of body language, the body language of the speaker should really make the speaker comfortable. You should refrain when you're speaking from leaning forward or behaving in an aggressive manner or anything else in which your body language would convey something different than you're trying to. Speakers should try to understand the listener's perceptions. Not everybody perceives everything the same way, and communication, ideally in organization, should be a two-way process. We should also avoid things like cultural barriers. A cultural barrier example might be, well, maybe how the speaker greets his or her listener. some people greet by hugging, but if you can imagine, if the listener has some sort of, let's say they're autistic and they don't like to be touched, that could be an extreme barrier to listening. Who's going to listen right after they completely shut down because of something like hugging or something like this? All right. Speakers really should concentrate on what they want to say, but they really also need to give importance to how they say it. The majority of communication is not verbal communication, it's nonverbal communication. And if you wanted to break it down into how important each of the two was, verbal communication, what comes out of my mouth, that's only about 10% of it. Nonverbal communication makes up the rest. That's all of the gestures, the posture, the facial expressions, the tone of voice, the eye contact. These are the things that reinforce the meaning. So think about that. If I'm communicating and we're not in the same room, we're not face to face looking at one another, the words that I say, the words that I choose can really make a difference. Sarcasm should not go into the written word. It does not come across because you don't have that component of nonverbal communication. Every time we communicate, the goal of nonverbal communication should be to reinforce the message and the meaning of the message. Now, here in the United States, we prefer making eye contact. When you make eye contact in the United States, research shows that indicates integrity, trust, respectful attention, being honest in our communications. Is that true in every country? No, but in the United States, it is. In the United States, we should use moderate tones as per the requirement of the situation. So have you heard anybody ever say, use your inside voice, right? We need to make sure that we're speaking loud enough that they understand, but not so loud that it's abrasive. We also, there's been a lot of research as to into tone and gender in communication, particularly when, well, there's been research where men will actually tune out a voice that is too high pitched, and so oftentimes when you're trying to communicate, particularly if women are trying to communicate, they might choose to take a lower tone of voice. It's also important that we speak slowly. We should adopt gestures and postures that show confidence, openness, coherence. It's also important that we're able to understand and interpret the nonverbal cues that we're receiving from other people. It's also important to use the tools of active listening. And active listening is when we focus our complete attention on the speaker. We actively listen to what they say. We reiterate what they say. We clarify what the person says so that we show that we understand. We use gestures like nodding and smiling to show that we care and that we're listening. All right, here's some other tips for active listening. The higher that you go in the organization, the more you'll find that people are good at listening. You don't move up in an organization if you're not good at listening to other. You'll find that people tend to tell more to people who listen better. So polishing your listening skills is likely to help you move up in an organization. So this slide shows some of the listening do's and don'ts in the American culture, things that you should do. Summarize, ask yourself, what's the key point? In fact, after every lecture that I ever watch, I always take a few minutes to step back, write down a couple of things. And I even if I just can write down one thing, that helps so much. I'll write down, what's my key takeaway? What was my takeaway from that lecture? Even just one sentence. It's amazing how that active process of writing that down really solidifies that message, and it helps me really focus on what's salient in the lecture. Don't look at your emails. Don't look at your texts. Don't have your phone sitting on the desk when somebody's talking to you, and constantly look at it. And don't speak the moment that somebody stops talking. It is so disrespectful to immediately just jump in and talking. Just taking a 1-2 beat pause and then talking shows the speaker that you care and that you're listening to what he or she said. Listen with your ears, listen with your eyes, look, especially if you're doing business in America, look at the person. It was funny. I've been teaching business communication for a few years, and I've been saying that for years. And I had somebody who came in for an interview as a project in the business communications class, and she stared at me the entire time, and I started to get a little uncomfortable. I finally had to stop her and ask, like, why, do you need to blink? Do you want to look away for a second? And she said, well, you told me to look at you, and so I'm trying really hard not to close my eyes even once. It was funny. So yeah, try to do it in a way that makes sense. Nod, smiles, like I said, leaning forward. It's a great idea to use verbal feedback, use questions to show that you understand, and say, so questions, things like, so what you're saying is this, or why do you think that? Just clarifying statements really show people that you care and that you're listening, and it helps you as well. Don't get too comfortable too, though. There's been research that shows that people feel like other people are listening when they lean forward. However, men tend to listen better when they're leaning back. So if you are a man and you're listening, be conscious that it's better to sit forward, because people think that people are more likely to think that you're listening. Don't pick up your phone. Don't look at your phone. If you're listening, that means you're not on the phone. Don't interrupt other people. Don't try to finish other people's sentences. All right. So there's a lot of different communication channels, and choosing the right channel matters. Remember when we talked about generational cohorts? Different generations respond better to different communication channels, and different channels are appropriate in different settings. For example, is a text message ever appropriate in business? Well, sure. In certain cases, a text message is absolutely appropriate. Now, would you want to send a text message to one of your employees letting her know that she's fired? Well, probably not. Would you want to send a text message to your CEO asking for a raise? Probably not. You really need to analyze analyze the audience and analyze the communication channel before you choose one. You also need to make sure that you're using the right channel for the right excuse me, for the right setting, and choose the channel with the most context. By that I mean face-to-face is the best, and it's the best for most things. Choose face-to-face meeting for anything that is, particularly anything that includes emotion. So like the example I gave about firing somebody or asking for a raise, there's going to be emotion in there. I'll try to keep the emotion out of it, but make sure that there's face-to-face, so that the recipient or the listener knows that that you care. So some of the key channels that we see: texting, memos, email, voice email. My goodness, email is taking over our communication channels here in the United States. The average business professional gets now over 100 emails a day, non-spam emails. And I can say for me, it's even more than that, which it's ludicrous. Telephone conversations, video conferencing, in-person, face-to-face, in-person presentation, face-to-face. There's so many communication channels. Pick the right one. All of these are good for different things. I was going to say something else about this. There are pros and cons to each, right? Pros and cons to each. I'm going to tell you something else. Oh, I wanted to say this. One of the skills that employers are looking for is communication, right? And communication in each of the different settings. So really get good at communicating in each of these different settings, including texting. So there's a several-part process to communicating effectively. It begins with the audience analysis. So analyze the audience, think about who they are, their education level, how professional they are, their expectations. Always, in every bit of business communication, I cannot stress this enough, be concise. Concise means short. Get to the point. Avoid slang. Avoid bias, preconceptions about age or gender or race. Whenever possible, use the active voice, right? So you don't want to say something like, the message was sent by Brett. Instead, the active voice would be, Brett sent the message. You don't want to say, the jungles are roamed by monkeys, right? Monkeys roam the jungle. A movie is going to be watched tonight by us. That's terrible, right? How would you say that? We're going to go watch a movie tonight, right? Yeah. By whom were you taught business management? Right. Who taught you business management? The active voice, the subject performs the action, express the verb. Use the, you want to strike the right tone. You want to use the direct or deductive approach anytime you're writing. The direct, and we talked about this, I gave you some directions to this in your class. In the class, isn't that correct? I hope I did. I told you always use the deductive approach. That means you start with the primary message or as your topic sentence, and then you give support for it, right? You give support for it. The ABCs of business, the ABCs, accuracy, right? You want to be right. Brevity, right? And clarity. Brevity needs to be short, clarity be clear. In the deductive approach, every single form of business communication, you always want to keep it under 100 sentences per paragraph. Keep those paragraphs very short. What else? Avoid grammatical errors. You use those block paragraphs. That means we don't indent in business writing. You always use headings. You always use bullets in business writing. That way we don't have to figure it out and look around for what you're trying to say, right? You don't want to be chatty. You don't want to be overly formal. You just want to get to the point of business. We don't care about the fluff. Keep the fluff out of it, right? So the process for developing business messages is fairly straightforward. You plan, you write, you review. I'm sure you've been trained on this many times during your education. Even though they're not trained on this, they're actually not very good at it, which is surprising. I'm going to ask you this. Of the 3 stages of the process, what do you spend the most time on? The planning, the writing, or the reviewing? Well, if you're a bad writer, chances are you're spending most of the time on the writing. You should be spending most of the time on the planning. So this is the process, again, the plan, write, review process with the goals for each of it. I'll let you look through it, but it's worth it to note this isn't necessarily the linear process, even though it shows the arrow down, down, down. Sometimes good writers move back and forth between them. So expert writers are more likely to spend most of their time in the planning phase, and they're more likely to really think about what they're going to write to generate their best ideas, identifying the ideas well before they ever start writing. So you can see poor writers, first of all, poor writers don't spend enough time at all in the process. Average writers spend way too much time in the drafting or writing process, and they spend just a little bit of time reviewing. If you want to be good at writing, spend a lot of time planning, a little bit of time writing, and then review. Always review. You've got to edit to get rid of those mistakes in your writing. And it was really interesting to me, and this is through research, this is research fact, but to note that average writers spend a lot more time writing than good writers, really excellent writers. And I've noticed that's actually been true in my personal experience. I've gotten shorter and shorter in my writing as I've spent more time doing it. Again, the most important stage is planning. It's often called the AIM process, or the 3-step process. The planning is audience analysis, and information gathering and message development before you actually get into the writing stage. And if you're an effective business communicator, really effective business communicators possess an uncanny ability to step into the shoes of their audience members. They think about their audience's needs, their priorities, their values. They envision how their readers are going to respond when getting the message in thought and feeling and action. And they also consider how the message will affect their working relationship. Now, your readers inevitably will judge your recommendations, your requests, your other messages based on how they view your credibility. Many entry-level professionals will face this situation. They have relatively low credibility because they're newcomers or they're viewed as newcomers. Establishing a professional reputation takes time. It takes less time, however, if you stay aware of your strengths, your weaknesses, and your goals. Most importantly, your reputation depends on adding value in your workplace. So you can gain credibility by setting up a time to talk with your boss, explain your growth in various areas, ask about ideas, or ask for ideas rather about improving your professional reputation. Ask your boss if you can take on higher responsibility projects. Make sure you fit with the corporate culture in terms of the way that you dress, the way that you communicate. Remember back to the generational cohorts, baby boomers, traditionalists will judge you based on the clothes you are wearing more than anything else. And it's hard to break that judgment, that first impression once they make it. They will judge you within the first few seconds of seeing you. The same is true for millennials and post-millennials. However, it's more true for some of the older generations. So dress more professionally than you think is necessary if you want to be successful in business. More professionally, more conservatively, more business. And then later you can, after they get to know you and your credibility is well established, you can consider wearing a pair of athletic shoes. You can consider dressing a little less professionally. But until that happens, you should be dressed successful for the job that you want someday in the organization, not the job that you have, and it's as professional as possible. Attend a lot of meetings to get to know as many colleagues as possible. Participate appropriately. Don't try to dominate the conversation or show off. But if you have something to add it. Be proud of yourself. A good way to establish a reputation is create a blog about some little niche area that you know more than other people so that they can see, wow, so-and-so is an expert in that particular area. And then share that on LinkedIn. Now, when you're, I'm going to share with you an interesting statistic involving the audience. Telling a story or anecdote using a relevant simile or metaphor and asking an engaging question help the opening of any presentation be successful. Before you ever launch into the body of your presentation, the speaker needs to tell the audience the key points of the presentation, ideally with a visual reinforcement. You should say, this is what we're talking about. Use your body to emphasize the importance of it and point out the things that he or she needs to know. You need to also do the same thing, support your conclusion with your body language. Prepare. The more you prepare, the more you will have confidence, and you'll be more dynamic in your delivery. And if you want some advice from me, somebody who's delivered hundreds of thousands of presentations through my life, be clear, be concise. Don't be afraid of the questions. The more you've prepared, the easier the question section will be. And speak louder than you think you need to. Speak slower than you think you need to. You'll do fine. Again, like I said, make sure I gave you some tips on closing, on questions. What else did I want to give you? Oh, I wanted to tell you, use visual aids in your presentation. Use PowerPoint, use Google Presentation. Don't just stand there with nothing else for them to look at. And in those Google presentations or PowerPoints, use pictures, not clip art, because clip art is so 1992. Pictures add value, and pick the pictures correctly. Choose pictures that really do add value or add something to the presentation. And I thought this was really interesting, and I wanted to share this with you. Research says that being a little bit nervous actually helps the speakers make better presentations. That's based on research, metadata. So if you're a little nervous, that's okay. That's okay. That helps you to be better at what you do. And surprisingly, hostility that is actually easy to manage. One of the great tips that I've learned about dealing with hostility from audience members: ignore them. If somebody is doing something that you don't like, is trying to ask a question or trying to get attention, speak over them, ignore them. Just go on. Never apologize in a presentation. Never say, I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. Never admit you're wrong in a presentation. Always just go on. Fake it till you make it. No one will know that you did something wrong in the presentation unless you tell them that you did it wrong. Make sure that you incorporate a little bit of humor into the presentation. And if not humor, at least a smile. Research shows that people are more willing to trust somebody that they like, to buy from somebody that they like, and to feel sympathy towards somebody that they like. And they like people who smile. So smile at the beginning of the presentation. People will like you for it. People are more likely to feel like they're rooting for you in the presentation. Be dynamic in your delivery. Don't just read the slides. Instead, treat it like a story, right? Treat it like a story that you're telling. Use examples, use analogy. Know your presentation front and back so that when you're describing it to them, they feel like, yes, she knows what she's doing. And here are 10 tips that will help you to give a dynamic presentation. A lot of these I've already said. Slow down, listen to yourself, stick to the time, practice the time. In my classes, I'll stop you if you go over on time. In my business, when people try to come and give presentations for my business, even my employees, I always tell them, you have 10 minutes, I'll stop you at 11. And it really helps people to get better, because if I don't say that, they'll go on for 15, 20, they'll go on for 30 minutes. No, not going to happen in my business. Know your material, look at your audience, but don't stare at your audience. Again, I gave you that example. Also, I've been doing this teaching gig now for over 10 years, and people over the years just stare at me when they're giving the presentation. Don't stare at any one person. Look around the room, look over their heads. It's okay to use notes in a presentation. Never use really big notes like this, because what happens if you're nervous is you start shaking like this. Instead, it's better to use smaller notes, keep them low, be a little inconspicuous about them. Never apologize. Use natural gestures. Oh, okay, I'm going to tell you one last story and then I'll let you go. I had a graduate student a couple years ago from Germany, great student, smart as a whip. He was going to present his pitch up at Y Combinator. For those of you who don't know, that's the business incubator, one of the best in the world. It's up in Northern California. And he was going to present, and so we were practicing his pitch again and again. And the first time he gave his pitch, he stood there like a stick. He gave the whole pitch just like this. And I said, okay, calm down, smile, walk around a little bit and give the pitch. So then he gives it again. He walks back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, staring at the walls each time. And I was, okay, try to move naturally. It's a good idea to move, but don't walk too much. That's my story. Good luck with your communications. Like I said, take a communications class. You're going to love it. It's going to help you, and practice. You get better through the years. Just the other day, 2 days ago, I gave a presentation to over 500 people, and I wasn't nervous at all. No, a little nervous. Okay, I'll admit it. I was a little nervous, but not too nervous. And I did well, I think. I give presentations on the news. I give presentations hundreds of people, and it's not scary anymore. But when I first started, it was scary. So practice, and you'll just get better and better, and I know you'll do well. And that said, I'll see you soon. Have a great, I don't know what time of day it is for you. Great morning or night or whatever time of day it is, and I'll see you in the next lecture.